Russians have learned that there is an asymmetry in conventional warfare. The Russian military does not match that of the United States by far. How do you then balance out that asymmetry? One way to do that is to invest in much cheaper measures, these non-conventional active measures, to try to weaken Western institutions, undermine Western democracies, versus sending in the tanks.
Putin realizes that if we're divided as a nation, we cannot protect ourselves from threats within and without.
From the Russian point of view, political warfare is just part of the art of war.
What they're driving at over the longer term is to watch democracy crumble from the inside out.
I'm sitting with him at dinner. I told him I'd been at the memorial of the siege of Leningrad. And he said, I'll tell you a story. He said, my father was one of those people who was on the front lines and had gotten 24 hours off to go home. As he was walking down the street to his apartment, he saw a big pile of bodies, which was not at all uncommon. He saw a leg sticking out and a shoe on the foot, and he recognized that as being his wife. So he stopped and he screamed and said, that's my wife, I want my wife. The body collectors told him to leave, and he kept demanding. At this point, he's pulling his wife from under the pile. He took her to their apartment and nursed her back to health, and then after the war, she gave birth to Vladimir Putin. Putin sees himself as literally pulling the body of Russia out of the pile, the dustbin of history. You know, we are going to revive you. You are not dead, and I will take care of you. I mean, that is the mindset.
I think his ambitions always were to be the president and then gather all the instruments of power into the presidency.
His devotion to reasserting Russia's greatness is certainly in his self-interest, because he wants to be the czar. He wants to be the richest man in the world, and he wants to settle scores.
He made his way up through the KGB.
His role in the KGB was to support Russian intelligence officers living under assumed identities, under deep cover inside the United States, and developing active measures to impact the policies of the United States.
The KGB was power. If you said that you were with the KGB, doors would open, people would stand aside.
In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, every republic that emerged from the debris of the Soviet Union agreed at the time to recognize the republics in their then existing borders.
Putin, like many Russians, feels that the dissolution, the dissolving of the Soviet Union was a horrific thing because it made the Russian people and Russia itself smaller. And the Americans are celebrating all of this.
А именно трагедия распада нашего государства. А иначе как трагедия это не назовешь. Я думаю, что как раз деятели октября 17 года заложили мину замедленного действия под это здание. Под здание унитарного государства.
I think he's dedicated to building it back up.
The first time I met him in the spring of 1991, he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, working for the mayor, whose name was Anatoly Sobchak. Sobchak was this charismatic, Western-leaning guy, allied with Boris Yeltsin. His deputy was the exact opposite of that. Nondescript, gray bureaucrat, very soft-spoken. Had you asked me back then to name 1,000 people that might be the next president of Russia, he would not have made my list.
He supported Mayor Sobchak, but he was also organizing this incredible network of former KGB, foreign economic interests, and local interests.
In the 1990s, St. Petersburg was known for organized crime and corruption. State institutions were partnering with criminal organizations to rip off as much as they could, as fast as they could.
Putin was a pretty good fixer. He could make stuff happen. He knew how to work the system.
Но это
Mr. Putin was able, as deputy mayor, to be the focal point of all of these different networks as they came together.
He was made FSB director.
The FSB is responsible for internal spying. These are the guys who have the most funding, the most resources.
He learned, which served him in good stead, how to maneuver politically.
Направленные вами для в командировку для работы под прикрытием правительства на первом этапе.
That became his primary goal of power. The FSB was simply a ladder.
Almost immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union, these oligarchs were able to take over state-owned enterprises at bargain basement prices, turn some of these individuals into multimillionaires or even billionaires almost overnight.
Under Yeltsin, the oligarchs became very powerful and very independent, and the power of the state was crumbling.
At the end of the Yeltsin years, he obtained almost sort of a buffoonish type of personality, a drunk, a little bit out of control.
Yeltsin was nervous, and he chose to go with the guy that he thought would protect his family and their assets. That's, I think, the sole purpose why Putin was selected to then run for president.
Followed by the bombings of the apartment houses.
There were a series of terrorist attacks in 1999.
They found evidence of the FSB having been there and set that all up.
I know what has been alleged. I find the evidence compelling. And I know those terrorist attacks helped Vladimir Putin win the election. I'm not ready to believe yet, and maybe that's just my idealism getting in the way of my analytic side, that the Russian government would kill its own civilians to elect Putin president.
The apartment bombings were KGB operations using a type of explosive that was only made in a KGB facility.
Oh, sure. It was very clever, and the Russian people began to look for a leader. It's not the first time in history. You could compare it to some degree to the 1930s and the rise of Adolf Hitler.
Дорогие друзья, до наступления 2000 года все доброе и все хорошее, счастье, и поднимем бокалы.
With respect to democracy, I think he was pretty clear from the very get-go. He feared independent actors.
Президента Российской Федерации.
Putin started forcing the independent media to knuckle under, putting in state control, turning it into propaganda outfits.
The West is not monitoring.
Started arresting people who had different points of view.
Then he starts going after independent journalists. They start ending up dead, assassinated.
The most prominent journalist in Russia, Anna Politkovskaya, was murdered on Putin's birthday.
Putin brought the oligarchs to heel.
Почему здесь-то забегали все как тараканы перед самым мы подписали этот договор? Да. Олег Владимирович подписал? Что я не вижу уже. Идите-ка.
A number of them were forced to leave the country. Some were killed in mysterious fashions. Those who remained are basically lapdogs of his.
Кто не согласен с этой позицией, знаете, как раньше говорили, иных уж нет, а те далече.
Putin was letting everyone know that this period of everybody getting to do their own thing was very much over.
And then he dropped his most trusted friends and confidants from the intelligence services into the key positions controlling all those businesses.
Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs use money essentially stolen from the Russian people.
If you're one of these big kleptocrats, getting your stolen proceeds into a rule of law system is one of your highest priorities.
Once that money is laundered, they have access to Western banks and they can do whatever they want.
Semyon Mogilevich was the first big organized crime figure in Russia who figured out how to launder massive amounts out of Russia and the former Soviet Union.
Simeon Mogilevich is worth about $10 billion, according to FBI reports. He's considered the money laundering genius. He's sometimes called the brainy Don because he has an economics degree.
The most important of the Russian crime bosses, a man who was for years on the 10 Most Wanted list in the United States.
He still lives happily in Moscow today.
In Russia, he still gets the VIP treatment and is rarely without a bodyguard who chauffeurs him in his 200,000-pound armor-plated bomb-proof limousine.
Why did you set up companies in the Channel Islands?
The problem was that I didn't know any other islands. When they taught us geography at school, I was sick that day.
The Russian mafia is an adjunct of the Russian government.
I've described it as going from organized crime under the Soviets to disorganized crime under Yeltsin to organized crime again under Putin.
Those networks recycle back to Mr. Putin's inner circle, and they continue to help maintain Mr. Putin's power.
To the point where today, Putin may well be the wealthiest man on the face of the planet.
How does Russia launder money into America?
Everything I know that's interesting, I can't tell you. Now, let me try to think of a way to go at 30,000 feet. Yeah, I know where you're going with this, because I know we're going to talk about Trump in a few minutes.
In the 70s. Donald Trump is the scion of one of the biggest landowners along the East Coast.
He played Monopoly, yes indeed. More than Monopoly, he played with building blocks. Always with building blocks.
He has huge ambitions, huge ego, as we know.
Because not everybody is meant to be a business person. They'll ruin their lives. I mean, they'll go and they'll put up their house and they'll mortgage their cars and everything else they own.
And he is starting to move into Manhattan.
Trump Tower was structured in a way that made it a money laundering paradise.
Trump Tower became one of the first buildings in New York where shell companies could buy and sell condos without identifying yourself.
If you go back to the 80s, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson got a bill through Congress allowing the immigration of Soviet Jews to the United States at a time when immigration had been highly restricted.
We'll honor the right of a person to leave a country freely and return freely, just as clear as anything can be.
The Russians saw it as an opportunity to open their jails. And that's when you see members of Russian organized crime come to the United States for the very, very first time and end up in Brighton Beach.
There were certain techniques for money management and money movement that were prized above others. And these involved real estate.
It started off simply as money laundering, pure as simple. And you had in 1984, for example, David Bogadin, who was a Russian mobster, met with Trump. Trump Tower had just opened the previous year, and Bogadin, who had no legal way of making that money, sat down with Trump and bought 5 condos, and the state attorney general ruled that that was money laundering. Vyacheslav Ivankov, who was very close to the great mastermind of organized crime, Semyon Mogilevich, and he was sent to the United States to oversee the rise of the Brighton Beach Mafia. And when the feds were looking for him, they looked all over, and they couldn't find him anywhere in Brooklyn. Instead, he was living in Trump Tower.
Donald Trump marries Ivana. The Czech secret police takes note of this. The intelligence that they gathered was that Donald Trump was being pressured, not clear by whom, to run for president as early as 1988. They thought that it would be good for Czechoslovakia if this husband of a Czech citizen became president of the United States. After his successes in New York City, he got into the Atlantic City casino business.
He goes big, builds the Trump Taj Mahal.
Which will be the largest hotel casino in the world, and I think it's going to be a tremendous success.
That turns out to be his undoing.
In a town where, for the last 10 years, no casino with 60,000 square foot has ever been fully utilized, on what basis would someone build one with 120,000 feet? He was destined to fail.
Trump Casino was hit hard for having violated U.S. federal anti-money laundering regulations. It suggests a culture of willful disregard of the law.
He basically unravels financially. He also was unraveling personally at the same time. His marriage was falling apart.
By that point, he had filed, I believe it was 6 bankruptcies. He had no way to move forward professionally. He couldn't get a bank loan anywhere.
There was a homeless person sitting right outside of Trump Tower. I remember my father pointing to him and saying, you know, that guy has $8 billion more than me, because he was in such extreme debt at that point, you know?
The Russians have a particular type of mark whom they go after. They go after somebody who has business resources, perhaps some shady morals, so that they're amenable to the bribery, or perhaps are in a difficult financial situation and either has political connections or aspirations. I've just described Donald Trump. He was the perfect mark for the Russians.
The Russians saved him. They rescued him. He would not have gotten back in business without them. I think it's safe to say he couldn't have run for president if he had just been a guy who was $4 billion in debt. When the Russian mafia does something, it's with Putin's permission, and it's serving his interests.
Have you ever knowingly done business with what I like to call organized crime? Have they ever stopped by?
I've really tried to stay away from them as much as possible. Although I must say, I have met on occasion a few of those people. They happen to be very nice people. You just don't want to owe them money.
Yeah, I understand.
Don't owe them money.
But now,
Semyon Mogilevich, he made a decision to make the move on Trump after studying Trump's 2004 bankruptcy filings. Noticing that Trump had lost his credit lines, they felt he would not be in a position to say no.
A Russian real estate firm, Bayrock, started leasing space in Trump Tower. Putin needs to keep track of his oligarchs, and one way of keeping tabs is knowing where their money is. Bayrock may well have been a way of doing that. To me, that's a turning point, because what we have here is a very serious intelligence operation, and it is in the belly of the beast. It is in the home of the man who becomes president of the United States, and it was operating there for many, many years.
One of the key people putting it together, Felix Sater,
a lieutenant in the Mogilevich crime family.
Very connected into the nexus between the Russian criminal organizations and the Russian national security organizations.
He became managing director of Bayrock. He himself had been convicted of 2 felonies.
Slashing a guy's face in a bar.
Another was a pump and dump stock scheme. But he ended up cooperating with the feds, and he started providing information on sales of weapons to Al-Qaeda. Mogilevich, according to FBI reports, was selling weapons to Al-Qaeda. That raises very interesting questions, because I don't think Felix Sater would betray Mogilevich. He famously threatened an investor with electrocuting his testicles. Trump worked with Sater for many, many years after it was revealed that he was a criminal. He continued to work for Trump and, in fact, had a business card saying that he was a senior advisor to the Trump Organization.
There's multiple photographs of the two of them together. He had an office in Trump Tower.
Trump was the public face of Bayrock.
And yet when he was placed under oath in a deposition and confronted about Sater, he simply says,
If he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like.
Trump actually personally asked Sater to escort his two children, Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr., on a trip to Moscow and showed them around the town.
He seems to be playing a consistent role in assisting the Trumps in tapping Russian, or let's say post-Soviet, money for developing condominium units. No co-op board that has to review whoever is buying. It's safer than putting it in a bank.
The Sunny Isles development is the Florida development that the Trumps own that has been heavily populated by Russians who want to launder their money.
At least a third of the condos in Sunny Isles, Florida, have been sold to Russia.
Trump Soho is one of the promoters of the project. Alexander Mashkevich has been described as Mogilevich's banker. The Trump Tower project in Baku is located in the middle of a post-industrial sledge pool. It's just sort of a joke that they were building this.
Trump World Tower, I started looking at who bought into it, and the very first name I came across that was Russian was that of Eduard Nektalov. He'd been indicted for money laundering. He turned state's evidence and was going to cooperate with the feds. He was murdered the next day.
The Toronto Tower, the source of funding was Vinesh Econom and Vinesh Torgbank, the two twin cash management tools of the Kremlin. They go out and become involved in projects, usually because one man, Vladimir Putin, tells them to do so. That would link this project straight back to the Kremlin.
I think this is the tip of the iceberg. There's been $1.3 trillion in flight capital since Putin's become president. There are over 30 Trump Towers all over the world. That means there's several thousand units. So many condos that journalists like me have been unable to investigate because they are in shell companies.
Shell corporations, where law enforcement and the public and the press can go and see what the name of the corporation is, but they can't find out who's really behind it, what's really going on, who's pulling the strings here.